Psychedelic Delirium. Yo, what's going on? It's Someone That's Someone, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report was sent in by Josh Silver, or Raaxxis. The drugs used, mirtazapine and caffeine, at a dose of 210 milligrams of mirtazapine and 300 milligrams of caffeine. The route of administration, orally, gender, male, and the setting, mainly in his room. Alright, I'm happy we're finally back after this long break. Feels way too long, and like I stepped into a different reality for a minute there. But we're back today here with the regular uploads, starting with this classic story from Josh. A first-time mirtazapine trip that carries both psychedelic and delirium qualities. This was one of the reports that was removed, and it has been remastered to better fit the guidelines. If you remember, this experience was quite juicy. There's a lot of novel effects that were reported, and a lot of visuals seen, especially when it comes to insects and internal structures. We don't hear about this one very often. It is something a bit more rare to come by and even be considered for usage. So this report definitely sheds some light on this substance. Mirtazapine itself is a somewhat odd antidepressant. I say odd because the way it acts compared to other antidepressants is very much in its own lane. As you can imagine, from a substance that causes both psychedelic and delirium effects. It plays roles on antagonizing histamine and also agonizing some 5-HT receptors. This substance affects many areas of the brain we'll have to dive into with another report. But I'm sure you'll enjoy this one if you haven't heard it already, but if you have, get ready for a remastered classic. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. This particular drug had been gathering dust on the top shelf of the cabinet for quite some time. In fact, I didn't even know of its recreational potential until I discovered its Psychonaut wiki page while taking inventory of every drug in my house. Upon learning of its quasi-psychedelic and delirium properties, I became immediately interested. I didn't have to feel bad about taking the mirtazapine for myself, since they were prescribed for my mother, who later discovered she was allergic to them. If not for me, they probably would have been thrown away. I know, I'm so kind. It was just past 6 p.m., and I knew that it would be wise to wait until the next day to dose, as it was almost certain that I just simply didn't possess the willpower to resist mirtazapine sedation into the early morning. I was slightly tired, but being the impatient, instant gratification obsessed teenager that I am, I decided to take the 14 pills anyways. They were taken on an empty stomach. 10 minutes in, the first effect that manifested itself was a significant loss of motor control. I attempted to stand up to hug my boyfriend goodbye and barely had the coordination to not trip over my own chair. He told me that I was slurring my words, although I personally couldn't tell. He left immediately after, and I decided to go to the bathroom while I still could. 15 minutes in. While doing what one usually does on a toilet, I noticed movement in the lower left of my vision. I turned my head to look at what it was, but when viewed directly, it was just an insignificant patch of dark stains on the wall. I reached out to touch it, just to make sure it was real. Sticky. It was real. Gross, but real. Intrigued, I slowly moved my vision away from the patch of stains. The further away my vision strayed, the more the patch of stains appeared to slowly inch forward. They also took on the distinct appearance of dozens of small black beetles. I found this particularly interesting because the beetles were the only visuals I got in the bathroom. No other surface, object, or pattern in the bathroom were behaving abnormally. After finishing up, I looked in the mirror while washing my hands. My eyes were bloodshot, or, at least, they looked like they were, and looked more exhausted than they would on a substance like cannabis. With nothing else to do that came to mind, I made my way back to my room and sat at my computer, messaging people to kill time. 25 minutes in. It was at this point I decided to close Messenger. My typing has slowed down to such a rate that it would take me upwards of a minute to finish typing out one sentence. My headspace felt rather clear, and I had no trouble articulating myself cognitively, but it took tremendous effort to find, impress, each individual key when trying to type out a thought. I spent the next 20 minutes or so trying to watch a YouTube video, but I was so tired I couldn't focus on it for longer than a minute. 45 minutes in. At this point, all the core effects that would persist throughout the trip had manifested themselves and would only continue to increase in intensity. I was experiencing even stronger motor loss control, an apparent increase in visual acuity, much to my surprise, overwhelming sedation, time dilation, distinct tracers, mild muscle relaxation, mild throbbing in my neck and head, noticeable short-term memory suppression, increased irritability, and closed and open eye visuals, which I will describe in detail further on in the report. These are all the effects that come to mind, although I'm sure I missed some. I had no particular expectation of what the visuals would be like. I knew the delirium-like visuals wouldn't be as intense as, say, diphenhydramine, which, sadly, I'll probably won't experience anytime soon, being in Australia and all. And I also assumed the psychedelia wouldn't be as vivid as an actual psychedelic. In retrospect, the later assumption wasn't entirely accurate. I expected an even blend of the two, and that's more or less what I got. The most apparent hallucination, and the only one that remained constant as long as my eyes were open, was what appeared to be numerous small flies darting across my visual field, approximately 5 centimeters away from my face. They numbered about half a dozen or so at any given time, and were slightly fuzzy due to motion blur. They would mainly move diagonally or horizontally, not vertically, and would individually only appear for a fraction of a second. They moved on a two-dimensional plane, and appeared to be more of a filter over my vision rather than a convincing hallucination. No matter where I looked or what I was looking at, and regardless of whether I was moving my head or not, their behavior, our number, did not change. I found myself staring at my monitor, mind completely blank, unsure of what to do next. I looked down at my keyboard and noticed the surface on which it was lying was moving. I turned slightly to my right and moved my head close to the white coating of my desk. The once coarse surface now appeared to be perfectly smooth and covered with a psychedelic pattern one might see on LSD. It consisted of hundreds, if not thousands, of fine lines which varied in translucency. They would travel a short distance and then turn at an immediate right angle, resulting in the pattern appearing to be made of a myriad of overlapping squares and rectangles. I was absolutely enthralled, partly due to the complexity of the pattern, but also of how impossible it was to gather the energy to change task at the time. 50 minutes in, I felt like I had not slept for weeks and started to bargain with myself. Okay, for every 5 minutes you have your eyes open, you're allowed 1 minute with your eyes closed. And so I did. I rested my head on my desk for some glorious shut-eye for several seconds before I nearly jumped out of my seat. Out of the pitch-black darkness, behind my eyelids shone a seemingly impossible flash of white light that vanished as soon as it appeared. Needless to say, I felt much more alert after that. Even though I was much more awake than I was a minute ago, I remember the anhydrous caffeine, 100 milligrams per pill, in my drawer for emergencies such as these. It wouldn't hurt to take a few, I thought. Without much thought, I poured 3 pills into my hand, 300 milligrams, and swallowed them almost immediately. Luckily, I remembered to have a water bottle with me, which I used to take the pills. I usually feel the effects of caffeine within 10 minutes, so I got up to find something to engage me while I waited. It's worth saying that I did not notice the effects of the caffeine at all throughout the rest of the night. I turned my chair around, but as I did so, something caught my eye. There was a large mess on the wall close to my door. Usually there's a small part of the wall where paint is missing, leaving a large brown circle. But what I was seeing wasn't just a spot of missing paint. It was moving. It was a massive, flat beetle. I'm not sure exactly what kind of bug it was. Slowly crawling along my wall. It was roughly 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, bigger than any bug I had seen before. but instead of being mortified like I normally would be, I reached out to touch it, and as I did, it just disappeared. It turned back into the dark, paintless circle it was before. This was not, however, the only thing on my wall. The paint in my room is cracked in various places, leaving obvious marks all over the walls. At first, I forgot the cracks were even there to begin with. Wait, did my walls always look like this? I asked myself. Not only this, but there seemed to be considerably more cracks on my walls than there normally would be. It was like the cracks had multiplied 2 or 3-fold. The cracks were also slightly wiggling. It was subtle at first, but it soon became far more pronounced. The larger cracks appeared like huge worms or snakes, while the smaller cracks appeared like smaller worms or grubs. The hallucinations weren't particularly convincing, but they were quite distinct. 1 hour in. This is when the sense of impending doom first began to develop. I wasn't feeling particularly anxious or scared beforehand, and the hallucinations didn't bother me at all. However, I felt as though if I stayed awake any longer, something terrible would happen. Perhaps I would hallucinate a 2-foot wide tarantula. Who knows? All I knew is that I had to get to bed ASAP. I grabbed my sleeping mask, turned off my monitor, and got into bed as fast as I could. In retrospect, part of me regrets not exploring the open eye visuals further. I feel like there's a lot of interesting effects I missed out on. However, in saying that, what I experienced in my bed was my favorite and the most pleasant part of the trip. I will not be timestamping the following portion of the trip, since my sense of time was heavily distorted, as I learned soon after. Closed eye experience. I knew that mirtazapine produced prominent closed eye visuals, but at the same time, I couldn't quite recall what they were. Initially, seconds after I put on the sleeping mask and lied down, there was total darkness, but seconds after, I noticed white specks of light in the distance that were slowly growing in size. They then stopped enlarging after only seconds. Following brief stillness, there were bright flashes of white light that would happen every second or two. They occurred at various points in my visual field, and seemed to be completely random. The flashes were quite large and would disappear almost instantaneously. While this was happening, I experienced perhaps the most fascinating effect of the entire trip. Very briefly, my vision would entirely consist of an entirely still image of World of Warcraft. Specifically, for those who played the game, an image of the center of the Druid-class Order Hall. It was from a first-person perspective. For the 2 or so seconds that the image existed, I was completely delirious. I totally believed I was just standing in that location in the game. I did not, however, recognize that what I was seeing was from World of Warcraft, or from any game at all. It just seemed to be real life for me. It didn't feel odd at all. I just thought I was chilling out in some forest. Only after the image disappeared did I realize, what the hell? Was I just in WoW? This would happen 2 or 3 times every minute, each time with the exact same image and level of delirium. And after the image would disappear, I would be right back where I left off, and the flashes in the darkness would continue like nothing had happened. They did not reset. After an indeterminate period of time, another internal hallucination began to manifest. Again, it started at complete blackness, with no objects or patterns in sight, except for a small dot in the center of my vision, which would slowly change colors. It began as red, then orange, then yellow, and gradually cycled through every color of the visible electromagnetic spectrum. Lines then began to draw themselves, originating from the dot in the center. These lines behaved similarly to the ones I saw earlier on my desk. They too would travel a short distance and then turn at a right angle. They were one fixed color, unlike the dot in the center. They were on a strictly 2-dimensional plane and had no depth. Traveling fairly quickly, it was not long before they had finished their self-drawn picture. It was a large, multicolored, circular maze. It was extremely detailed and intricate. and although I did not have time to solve it, it was subconsciously inferred that it did, indeed, have a solution. It would then collapse and redraw itself in an identical fashion. This particular hallucination did not last for very long and only repeated this cycle a few times before I moved on to the next hallucination. The final hallucination I experienced would last until I awoke. Like all the ones before it, it would begin in total void. Then, a shape slowly faded into view. I immediately recognized what it was, a large moth that took up approximately a third of my visual field. It appeared as though a red light filter had been placed over the moth because its exterior was comprised of varying shades of red. Not the typical brown cream color of most moths. It was completely stationary, as if it was dead. Immediately upon becoming opaque, however, it became animated and fluttered away, leaving a faint red trail behind it. As soon as it flew away and was no longer visible, another moth, identical in shape and color, would fade in at another point in my vision and repeat the same process. Luckily, I am not scared of moths. Otherwise, this would have been an extremely disturbing hallucination. The moths would vary slightly in size, and there would occasionally be a second moth that appeared simultaneously, although this was a rare occurrence. As stated, no other hallucinations appeared after this one. Compared to the rest, this one lasted a considerable amount of time. It's important to note that I felt completely lucid the entire time. There didn't seem to be any psychedelic mental effects whatsoever. It was just like watching a video, but behind my eyelids. After this, I think I fell asleep. 2 hours, 45 minutes in. After some time, I have no idea how long I was awake in bed before falling asleep. I woke up. Must have been 2 to 3 a.m. I got out of bed and checked my phone for the time. 9 p.m. This was beyond shocking. I can't even recall seeing any open-eye visuals at all at this point. The flies were gone, the snakes and worms on the wall were gone, there were no patterns on my desk, and the unpainted spot on my wall was inanimate. Nothing. I was still feeling drowsy and sedated. My motor control was still heavily affected, and I was feeling quite nauseous. Nauseous enough to vomit, in fact. So, that's what I did. I got to the bathroom as fast as I could and vomited some half-digested pills and stomach acid into the toilet bowl. After some heaving, I felt relieved and washed my mouth out with water, not from the toilet. I still wasn't seeing any visuals in the bathroom. I looked normal in the mirror. Since there didn't seem to be much else worth exploring, I decided to go back to bed. Although there were no open-eye visuals, the internal hallucination of the moths persisted. They behaved exactly the same and manifested themselves with a similar intensity as before. They remained until I fell asleep again. 12 hours, 15 minutes in. I was woken up by my mother at 6:30 a.m. She reminded me that I had a blood test to go to in half an hour, which I completely forgot about the night prior. I hoped that my large dose of mirtazapine wouldn't affect the results. I went into my brother's room to collect the clothes I had left there. They were on the floor, as usual. Upon bending down to get my clothes, I noticed that the carpet was still moving. I focused on it, and, indeed, the psychedelic visuals were still present. They weren't very intense, but they were far from subtle. The walls, bed sheets, floor, and anything else with an obvious texture were affected. Primarily, there was just visual drifting and pattern repetition. Also, objects in the dark seemed normal. I noticed no other after effects. 12 hours, 30 minutes in. I got in my mother's car and noticed the small brown and black particles of grime and dirt on the edges of the windshield were moving, but only in my peripheral vision. They behaved almost exactly like the patch of stains in the bathroom at the beginning of the trip. They looked and moved like small beetles and would reset if they moved too far from their original positions. I didn't notice any other visuals on the short drive to the clinic. 12 hours, 45 minutes in. Upon arrival, I took a seat in the waiting room with my mother and looked down the hallway. It gradually began to unnaturally elongate itself until it looked several meters longer than it actually was. The textures of the objects in the hallway also stretched. It will return to its normal length upon looking away and looking back. However, it would just begin to stretch again if I maintained my gaze for a few seconds. The patterns on the carpet also behaved like the carpet in my brother's room, albeit with slightly less intensity. 12 hours, 55 minutes in. Inside the room where my blood would be drawn, I was too distracted to notice any other effects. The pathologist noted that my blood was like syrup, but I doubt this had anything to do with my mirtazapine dose and more so to do with my lack of drinking water. 13 hours, 15 minutes in. Once I got home, I just went back to bed. 17 hours in. I woke up almost 4 hours later and noticed no effects at all. Final thoughts. It was certainly an interesting drug. It wasn't necessarily fun, but definitely novel. I regret taking the drug at the time I did, as I feel I didn't explore the effects as much as I could have. Given the opportunity, I would probably repeat my dose, but under more favorable conditions. I would likely also employ the aid of a trip sitter to assure me I'd be alright once the feelings of impending doom commence, or to wake me up if I fall asleep. All in all, a worthwhile experience.